I have a neighbor, Clara. If you saw her social media, you'd think she was thriving. She posts deeply insightful book reviews and sharp political commentary that get hundreds of likes. Her digital presence is vibrant, loud, and seemingly everywhere.
Right, it's that classic curated online life we all see.
Exactly, yeah. But there's a detail most people miss. The background of every single photo is the exact same corner of her living room, just with the lighting shifted. A few weeks ago, I ran into her brother in the hallway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was carrying 3 heavy bags of groceries and looked drained. When I asked how she was doing, he didn't talk about her quote-unquote success online. Instead, he told me that Clara hadn't crossed the threshold of her front door in 14 months.
14 months? I mean, that is a staggeringly long time.
Not for a walk, not for mail, not even a stand on the balcony. To the world, she's a brilliant mind. To her own nervous system, the hallway outside her apartment is a high-voltage zone. What's striking is the reaction of those who know.
They probably just tell her to get over it.
Right. Literally. They tell her to just take a walk or stop being so dramatic. They see a woman with all her limbs and a functioning intellect and assume her confinement is a choice, a simple lack of willpower. But when she looks at the front door, she doesn't see an exit, she sees a border.
Which, biologically speaking, is completely real to her brain.
Her world has shrunk from a city to a street to a single room, and yet on paper, she lives in a free society. This isn't just a story about Clara, it's a glimpse into a growing architecture of modern life that we rarely acknowledge.
We do our best to ignore it entirely.
We've spent centuries tearing down stone dungeons and iron bars, convinced we were ending the era of the prisoner. But in our silence and our obsession with performance, we've managed to build something much more efficient. The invisible prison.
That is such a heavy but incredibly accurate way to frame it.
These are spaces where the walls are made of neurological fatigue and social disappearance, and where millions are serving life sentences in plain sight without a single guard in view. And that is exactly what we are getting into today in this deep dive.
Yeah, because the contrast you are highlighting with Clara's situation is really the defining paradox of the modern era. We exist in a society characterized by unparalleled physical mobility and legal freedom, yet we're witnessing an unprecedented widespread rise in profound confinement.
It's like we're physically free but totally trapped.
Exactly. To understand how a mind traps itself inside a single room, we have to look entirely past the physical environment and examine the internal architecture of the human brain under duress. The modern world operates as a relentless, chronic stressor.
Right.
For a massive segment of the population, the resulting biological burnout creates an enclosure that is just as real and just as physically impenetrable as a steel cage.
That biological burnout is exactly what I want to explore, because there is another story in our sources that perfectly illustrates this mechanism. There is a woman named Sarah who lives in a hyper-competitive metropolitan hub.
Sarah, her case is fascinating.
It really is, because her life is the exact opposite of what you traditionally picture when you think of a hermit or a recluse. She works a high-level corporate job that demands a constant, unrelenting, cognitive on-call status. She's managing international teams, responding to emails at midnight, and constantly navigating complex, high-stakes social dynamics in the boardroom.
Which is incredibly taxing on the brain.
Right. But from a neuroscientific perspective, Sarah's life is a masterclass in how chronic stress physically rewires the brain into a self-imposed cell. Her amygdala, which is the brain's primitive alarm system, is permanently stuck in high gear.
It never shuts off.
Never. And at the exact same time, her prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex decision-making, emotional regulation, and social engagement, is essentially knocked completely offline.
It is a complete structural inversion of how the brain is supposed to function. I mean, in a healthy neurological state, the prefrontal cortex acts as the executive controller.
Like the CEO of the brain.
Exactly. It evaluates the environment, recognizes that a looming deadline or a crowded subway is not a literal apex predator, and sends inhibitory signals to the amygdala to calm down. A flax. Sarah is existing in a state of continuous, low-grade threat. The constant barrage of cognitive demands forces the amygdala to remain hyperactive. Over time, the prefrontal cortex simply exhausts its metabolic resources. It literally loses the ability to apply the brakes.
Which means that to the outside world, she looks like a highly successful, driven professional. But inside her skull, her nervous system has fundamentally convinced her that the world outside her front door is a lethal threat.
It's pure survival mode.
And the fallout of this was gradual but absolute. First, she stopped attending casual dinners with friends. Then she stopped going to the grocery store, opting exclusively for delivery.
Shrinking her radius step by step.
Yeah, eventually, she shrank her entire safe zone to the exact square footage of her studio apartment. And the crucial thing here is that she didn't do this because she was lazy or because she suddenly hated her friends.
No, she did it because her brain was frantically trying to conserve energy for survival.
Exactly. It's so easy for the people around her to dismiss this as mere social anxiety or a temporary rut. But we have to understand it as a severe physiological reaction to an environment that never, ever lets the human animal rest.
Society's default response is to tell people like Sarah to just get out more.
Right, which is so unhelpful.
It's completely unhelpful because it ignores that the wall-less prison is built out of their own hijacked neurochemistry. It is a biological survival mechanism that has gone catastrophically wrong in a world that asks far too much of our biology.
And when you say our biology, we're really talking about the social brain, right?
Yes, the specific neurochemistry you are referring to is the foundation of the social brain. Human beings do not just prefer company. We are biologically mandated to have it.
We're wired for it.
Deeply wired. The social brain is a highly distributed network of neural anatomical regions that evolved over millions of years exclusively to support our survival as a communal interdependent species. We are talking about the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporal parietal junction, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the superior temporal sulcus.
That sounds like a lot of different parts working together.
It is. This is not a simple single lobe. It is a vast, interconnected superhighway. Together, these regions execute processes that are incredibly metabolically expensive. They manage facial recognition, they parse subtle vocal tones for empathy, they regulate our behavioral output.
And they manage something called theory of mind, right? I saw that in the sources.
Yes, crucially, they manage theory of mind. That is the advanced cognitive ability to understand that other people have beliefs, intents, and desires that are entirely different from our own. It is the absolute bedrock of all human empathy.
Okay, let me push back on this for a second, because whenever we talk about the absolute biological necessity of social connection, there is always a question of introversion.
Sure, that always comes up.
Like, what about the people who genuinely, deeply enjoy spending an entire weekend completely alone? If this neural network requires constant, meaningful social input to maintain its structural integrity, are introverts slowly giving themselves brain damage by choosing to stay home and read a book instead of going to a party?
And that distinction is really the most important dividing line in this entire field of study. We have to draw a hard scientific boundary between objective isolation and subjective loneliness.
Okay.
Objective isolation is simply a metric. It is the frequency of social contact, how many distinct human beings you interact with in a 24-hour period.
Sure.
Subjective loneliness, however, is the internal emotional perception that your social needs are not being met.
So one is a number and the other is a feeling.
Exactly. And statistically, in massive population studies, those two things are only very weakly correlated. An introvert, like you described, has a lower threshold for social satiation.
So they just need less interaction to feel full.
Right. If they spend a quiet weekend alone, their social needs are still being met. They are in a state of chosen solitude, which is neurologically restorative. Subjective loneliness is entirely different. You could be standing in the middle of a crowded concert or living in a densely populated apartment building and feel entirely abandoned by the humanity surrounding you.
It is the feeling of being unseen, unknown, and unsupported.
Yes. Precisely.
So it's the difference between fasting and starving. Fasting is a choice that can actually trigger positive biological processes. Starving is a biological crisis that your body violently fights against.
Analogy.
And when an individual is pushed into that subjective starvation, a critical system called the default mode network, or DMN, starts to completely unravel. The DMN is essentially the brain's baseline state when you aren't actively focusing on the outside world.
Right. It's what your brain does when it's supposedly at rest.
Exactly. It is the network that powers introspective thought, mentalizing, and emotional self-reflection. When someone is chronically subjectively isolated, the connectivity within the DMN is disrupted. The brain literally stops processing the social world accurately.
It starts misinterpreting signals.
Yeah, begins to view a neutral facial expression from a stranger not as indifference, but as disgust or a potential threat.
And the health implications of that subjective state transitioning into a threat response are staggering. When you feel that your fundamental social needs are unmet, your body interprets this not as a fleeting sadness, but as a severe, imminent biological danger.
Which feels like such an overreaction from our bodies.
It does in the modern context, but historically it made sense. To put the scale of this into perspective, chronic subjective loneliness currently affects 25 to 50% of the United States population.
Wow. Up to half the population? Terrifying.
And the mortality risk associated with this condition is not trivial. Epidemiological studies place it as comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Really? 15 cigarettes a day just from feeling lonely?
Yes. It is a primary driver of cardiovascular disease. It drastically accelerates cognitive decline. And it is estimated to be the root cause of 11 to 18% of all depression cases in adults over the age of 50.
We really need to explain exactly how that leap happens. How does a feeling, something we usually relegate to, like poetry or philosophy, literally, physically destroy the cardiovascular system and age the brain? What is the exact mechanical breakdown here?
The mechanism is a chronic stress cycle driven by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, universally known as the HPA axis. This is the body's primary heavy-duty stress response system.
Okay, so how does it trigger?
When a person experiences subjective isolation, the brain registers a lack of safety. In our evolutionary past, being separated from the tribe meant you were going to be eaten by a predator or starved to death. So, the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which in turn signals the adrenal glands to flood the bloodstream with cortisol.
And cortisol is the stress hormone.
Right. Cortisol is excellent if you need to sprint away from a threat for 10 minutes. It diverts energy away from the immune system and digestion and pushes it all into the muscles and the heart. But when you are trapped in a wall-less prison of modern isolation, that HPA axis never turns off.
So you're just soaked in it.
Yes. The individual is subjected to a sustained, unending release of cortisol. Over months and years, this constant bath of stress hormones becomes highly neurotoxic. We can put these individuals in functional MRI machines and observe verifiable structural neurological damage.
Actual physical damage to the brain.
Really, there is a marked reduction in the gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. We also see significant degradation in white matter myelination.
Myelination?
Myelin is the protective fatty sheath that coats neural pathways. Think of it like the rubber insulation on an electrical wire. When it degrades, the electrical signals in the brain misfire and communicate far less efficiently.
And so without it, the signals just leak out or slow down.
Exactly. Structural MRI and diffusion tensor imaging, which tracks the diffusion of water molecules in brain tissue, have definitively shown that individuals experiencing chronic loneliness possess brains that appear chronologically years older than their actual biological age.
So it is essentially like a smoke alarm in a house that refuses to turn off. The amygdala is screaming at top volume that the house is on fire. It is drawing massive amounts of electricity, completely draining the battery of the entire house, which is the prefrontal cortex.
That's a great way to visualize it.
And eventually, to conserve whatever critical power is left just to keep the heart beating and the lungs breathing, the overarching security system forcibly locks the doors. It shuts down all external engagement. It traps the person inside because opening the door requires energy that the system simply does not have anymore.
That physiological mechanism is exactly what researchers observe in the anterior cingulate cortex. This is a region of the brain that evolved to process literal physical pain, the pain of a broken bone or a burn.
So it's our pain center.
Yes, but it has been entirely co-opted by the social brain to process social exclusion. When a person is rejected or isolated, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up with the exact same intensity as it would if they were physically injured.
So heartbreak is real. Biologically.
Very real. Society stretches this acute, agonizing emergency into a chronic, permanent baseline. The alarm never stops. However, if we look at the data derived from animal models, there is a crucial, hopeful dimension to this pathology.
Good. We need some hope here.
Research demonstrates that the brain remains plastic. Resocialization can actually reverse the neuronal restructuring. The physical degradation of the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala can be halted, and the tissues can be repaired through sustained, meaningful social reintegration.
So the damage isn't permanent?
No. The architecture of these invisible prisons is not permanent. It can be dismantled if the environment changes.
But if the cure is meaningful social reintegration, we have to seriously examine the external structures we've built to supposedly facilitate that integration. Because if we move from the internal cellular walls of isolation to the external societal structures, we find a system that leaves people completely dangerously adrift.
Yes, we absolutely do.
We have built a modern digital infrastructure that aggressively mimics connection while actively fostering confinement.
The external environment is arguably the most insidious aspect of this entire phenomena. We have engineered a society that provides the aesthetics of community while systematically stripping away the friction and the depth that actual human connection requires.
Consider a man from our sources named Marcus. Marcus is a top-tier digital creator. He manages a highly curated, incredibly active online community of 500,000 followers.
500,000? That's a massive audience.
Right. By every modern metric of success, his life is the absolute zenith of hyperconnectivity. His phone buzzes every 3 seconds with validation. He has an endless stream of comments, likes, and data points that simulate human connection.
But I'm guessing it doesn't actually feel like connection to him.
Exactly. Marcus experiences a profound, hollow loneliness that he likens to being trapped in an airtight glass box. Imagine him sitting in a crowded, trendy coffee shop. He is physically surrounded by dozens of people, but he is entirely unable to make eye contact with a single one of them because every single person in that room, including himself, is tethered to a digital ghost of a community.
Everyone is looking down at their screen.
Yeah. Despite his 500,000 friends, when his car breaks down, he has absolutely no one to call. He has no one to help him move a couch or simply share a quiet, unrecorded, unmonetized moment.
That is just incredibly bleak.
His screen is a prison that offers the flawless illusion of intimacy while simultaneously dismantling the actual physical community structures, the local parks, the neighborhood associations, the baseline local trust. This is not a personal failing on Marcus's part. It is a massive structural failure of the social fabric, leaving millions of individuals drifting completely alone in a sea of overwhelming data.
Sociologists have been tracking the mechanics of this structural failure for decades. The most prominent analysis of this shift is the work of Robert Putnam, who documented the profound decline of the bowling league.
A bowling league? Why bowling?
Putnam used the bowling league as a proxy for all forms of civic associations, local union halls, parent-teacher associations, and unmediated neighborhood gatherings. These were spaces where people interacted without a curated agenda, fostering a baseline level of societal trust and mutual reliance.
So it wasn't about the bowling itself, it was about showing up regularly.
Exactly. As these physical structures eroded, they were replaced by a phenomenon that French sociologists describe as solitude people, or populated loneliness. We now have millions of people living in hyperdense metropolitan areas, crossing physical paths with hundreds of individuals every single week on the subway or in the street, yet remaining entirely unknown to one another.
You see 100 faces on the train, but you don't know a single name.
Right. The friction of serendipitous physical community has been entirely removed in the name of efficiency.
It is the paradox of modern disappearance. When physical communal structures vanish, an individual's absence is no longer registered by the community. If you stopped going to the local hall or the neighborhood pub 50 years ago, someone noticed the empty chair and knocked on your door.
To check in on you.
Yeah. Today, if you withdraw from physical society, you don't leave an empty chair, you simply dissolve into the digital noise. No one comes looking for you because they assume you are just active on a different platform.
And we must understand that this digital noise is entirely non-neutral. The platforms facilitating this digital hyperconnectivity are governed by highly sophisticated algorithmic processes,
which are designed to keep us hooked.
Absolutely. These algorithms do not merely influence users from the outside. They fundamentally enter the constitution of the self. They reshape human desires. They alter the natural rhythms of sustained attention, and they degrade our modes of emotional self-regulation.
Fine, it's changing who we are at our core.
Individuals are conditioned to incorporate a disparate, chaotic set of digital evaluations, how many views a post received, the ratio of likes to comments, into their core identity. This inherently fractures the sense of self. We see the direct behavioral manifestation of this in practices like phubbing.
Phubbing, which is phone snubbing, right?
Yes. The act of snubbing someone in a physical face-to-face setting to look at a phone. Qualitative behavioral research shows that prioritizing a device over a physical person instantly generates acute feelings of severe loneliness and rejection for both parties involved.
Even for the person looking at their phone.
It completely halts the formation of trust and relationship building in real time.
It completely halts it because it is a physiological rejection, not just a social faux pas. When you communicate remotely or digitally, there is a distinctly decreased activation in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex compared to actual face-to-face interaction.
The brain knows the difference.
It absolutely knows. The brain recognizes that the interaction lacks stakes. It signals a distinct lack of the emotional engagement, the micro-expressions, and the physiological synchrony required to actually satisfy the human need for recognition.
The digital interactions are frictionless, and human empathy requires friction.
Yes, it's exactly like trying to survive by eating nothing but cotton candy. It completely fills the stomach, taking away the immediate pang of hunger so you feel full. But it provides absolutely zero caloric depth, zero protein, zero nutrients. Your body is physically starving to death while your stomach is completely packed.
That is exactly how the digital ecosystem functions.
The algorithms provide the aesthetic of connection without the neurological depth required to sustain the human psyche, and ultimately it just accelerates the psychological starvation.
That dynamic is best understood through the architectural concept of the panopticon. Jeremy Bentham originally designed the panopticon in the 18th century as the ultimate prison.
Yes, it's the circle prison, right?
Yes. It was a circular building with a central watchtower. The guards could see every single prisoner, but the lighting was designed so the prisoners could never see into the tower. Because the prisoners never knew exactly when they were being watched, they were forced to internalize the surveillance and constantly police their own behavior.
So they became their own guards.
The philosopher Michel Foucault later expanded on this, explaining how modern society uses surveillance to control populations. The modern digital landscape operates as the ultimate voluntary panopticon. Individuals willingly submit to constant observation.
Like tracking our own analytics.
They meticulously track their own metrics, their views, their social standing, and they adjust their behavior to please an unseen algorithm. They're seen by hundreds of thousands of strangers, but they're deeply, genuinely known by no one.
Being seen but not known, that's haunting.
And this generates the phenomenon termed extended loneliness. It is a severe, chronic state of unfulfillment born not from an isolation or lack of connections, but from an overwhelming overabundance of low-quality, curated online connections that completely fail to provide the empathetic, vulnerable encounter necessary for human neurological stability.
So we have the internal neurological prison of the hijacked amygdala, and we have the digital panopticon that starves the social brain. But the reality is that eventually people do have to log off.
They have to leave the house eventually.
Right. They have to step outside to commute, to work, to survive. And the physical world we are forced to navigate is often actively designed to be just as hostile as the digital one. We have to move from the digital architecture to the literal concrete architecture of our cities. We are currently designing physical environments that create massive, insurmountable psychological barriers for a huge portion of the human population.
The physical environment is never a neutral backdrop. Every single architectural choice, every urban planning mandate is an active participant in either facilitating public inclusion or enforcing public exclusion.
This brings us to Julian from our deep dive sources. Julian lived in what developers market as a state-of-the-art smart city, a metropolis built entirely of glass, steel, polished concrete, and high-intensity LED screens.
Sounds incredibly modern.
But Julian lives with an invisible sensory disability. To the architects who designed it, the city's celebrated efficiency is a triumph. To Julian, that exact same efficiency operates as a series of punishing psychological barriers. The relentless, unpredictable flicker of massive digital advertisements, the high-frequency acoustic hum of the transit systems echoing off the concrete, and the total, complete lack of sensory refuge turn his daily commute into an absolute gauntlet.
It's just a sensory assault.
Complete assault. The city is not a playground of opportunity for him. It is a fortress of profound overstimulation. The environment is so aggressive that it causes Julian to repeatedly retreat into his darkened bedroom just to let his nervous system recover. There is absolutely no physical wall stopping him from walking into a public square. But the sensory noise acts as an unscalable, invisible barrier.
And that's not him just being overly sensitive.
This isn't just Julian being sensitive. This is a profound, catastrophic failure of public policy and urban design. By prioritizing a theoretical, idealized average citizen, a person who does not actually exist, mind you, the vibrant energy of the city is weaponized against anyone who processes the world differently.
Julian's experience perfectly illustrates the core principle of the social model of disability. Historically, society operated on a medical model, which dictated that disability was an inherent flaw or deficit residing entirely within the individual that needed to be cured.
Like it was purely their problem to fix.
Right. But the social model of disability completely upends this. It argues that disability arises from the violent interaction between an individual and an environment filled with poorly designed physical, cognitive, and sensory barriers.
It's the environment creating the disability.
When you consider that a minimum of 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent, encompassing autism, ADHD, sensory processing disorders, and PTSD, designing a city that violently excludes them means failing the fundamental vision of public livability.
You're excluding 1 in 5 people.
Exactly. Exhaustive urban studies, particularly the highly detailed data gathered by the University of New South Wales regarding the city of Sydney and its public open spaces, reveal that this exclusion is not accidental. It is engineered directly into the very fabric of the streets.
Those urban studies are fascinating because they highlight 3 major pillars of neuro-inclusive urban design. If we want to tear down the invisible prison of the city, we have to address these pillars. The first one is predictability.
Predictability is huge.
When a city environment is highly unpredictable, it creates an intense, draining cognitive load on the brain.
Predictability is recognized as a primary access requirement for neurodivergent individuals. The barriers in urban environments are rarely fixed objects like a literal brick wall. They are dynamic barriers.
What does a dynamic barrier look like?
We are talking about highly unpredictable pedestrian flows where there is no clear right-of-way. We are looking at shared zones where bicycles, cars, and pedestrians mix without legible boundaries. We're looking at encroaching cafe furniture that changes the width of the sidewalk every single day.
Oh, right, where you suddenly have to walk in the street because a restaurant put out too many tables.
Exactly. When a pedestrian route completely lacks clear visual and spatial cues, or when temporary chaotic clutter continually forces an individual to alter their path, the environment demands continuous, exhausting vigilance. The brain is constantly running threat assessment protocols.
It's like navigating a minefield.
For a neurodivergent individual, the profound cognitive effort required to simply walk down a cluttered, unpredictable street can induce severe neurological fatigue, leading directly to a panic response or total withdrawal.
Which flows directly into the second pillar, sensory environments. You look at specific urban features that are built purely for vehicular or transit efficiency, like underpasses. The Devonshire Street Tunnel in Sydney is a perfect example of this hostility.
Underpasses are notorious for this.
If you were to walk down that tunnel, you are assaulted by the echoing, reverberating noise of footsteps and transit systems bouncing off hard ceramic tiles. You have the rapid, flickering strobe of aging fluorescent lighting. You are forced into close physical proximity with hundreds of strangers moving at different speeds, and there is absolutely no clear lateral exit if you become overwhelmed.
So you're just trapped.
Yes, it is a perfectly designed incubator for sensory overload.
The necessary architectural contrast to that hostile sensory environment is the intentional integration of green and blue infrastructure. This means integrating nature, water elements, and organic design into the dense urban core.
Like planting trees or having small fountains.
Yes, and these are absolutely not merely aesthetic choices made to make a city look pretty. They are fundamental neurological necessities. Natural environments provide a vital psychological buffer from urban intensity. They utilize natural, muted color palettes that do not trigger the visual cortex aggressively.
It's calming on a biological level.
Right. They rely on stable, non-glare walking surfaces, and they provide natural acoustic dampening through foliage and soil. Access to these regulated calm spaces directly dictates how long an individual can safely tolerate remaining in the public sphere before their nervous system demands a retreat.
And if they do need to recover, they rely entirely on the third pillar, amenities as inclusion infrastructure. When able-bodied neurotypical planners think of seating, public toilets, shade canopies, and drinking water fountains, they classify them as nice conveniences.
Like a bonus feature of a park.
Exactly. But for someone managing neurological fatigue, chronic illness, or sensory overload, A bench under a tree isn't just a pleasant place to sit. It is essential, critical infrastructure. It provides a localized safe zone.
It's a place to recharge.
Yeah, it allows them to pause, regulate their autonomic nervous system, manage their physical energy, and confidently remain in the public space rather than fleeing back to the isolation of their apartment. Evaluating a city's accessibility merely by measuring the width of its wheelchair ramps to comply with basic building codes is like evaluating a dense, complex book solely by checking if the font is legible. And yes, the font is technically readable, but it completely ignores whether the language, the narrative, and the environment are actually comprehensible and welcoming for the people trying to survive inside of it.
That analogy perfectly captures the absolute necessity of a paradigm shift in global urban planning. Neuro-inclusive design does not just serve a niche minority population. When you design a city that is legible, predictable, and sensorily accommodating, it profoundly benefits the entire population.
It makes life better for literally everyone.
Absolutely. By mitigating harsh, flickering lighting, dampening violent acoustic reverberation, and providing predictable, clear wayfinding, cities systematically dismantle the invisible sensory prisons that exile individuals like Julian. Furthermore, creating these supportive, low-stress physical communal spaces is the exact, literal intervention required to combat the sociological isolation, the collapse of the local community structures, and the digital panopticon we discussed earlier.
Because you need a physical space to build a physical community.
Yes, you cannot heal a socially starved brain if there is nowhere safe in the physical world for that person to exist.
We've spent this entire deep dive unpacking a reality that the vast majority of people walk past every single day without ever seeing. Modern society has successfully, systematically dismantled the physical dungeons and iron cages of the past. We no longer use stone walls to isolate the masses.
No, we don't need to anymore.
But in our relentless, unquestioning pursuit of economic hyper-efficiency, frictionless digital connection, and overwhelming urban energy, we have inadvertently constructed a vast, complex matrix of wall-less prisons.
These invisible structures are enforced simultaneously on multiple fronts, making them incredibly difficult to escape. They are maintained first by chronic neurological stress that fundamentally alters the physical structure of the brain, trapping the individual in a state of hypervigilance and shrinking their physical world to a single room.
Which is what happened to Sarah and Clara.
Right. Then they are perpetuated externally by algorithmic social systems that substitute quantifiable, shallow metrics for genuine human empathy, locking people inside a digital panopticon of continuous observation and profound loneliness.
The Marcus situation.
Exactly. And finally, they are cemented in the physical world by urban environments designed with absolutely no regard for sensory accessibility, turning the public square into actively hostile territory.
The recognition of these invisible borders is the absolute prerequisite for dismantling them. Whether that border exists in the hyperactive firing of an exhausted amygdala, the profound, unyielding isolation of a curated digital feed, or the sensory bombardment of a hostile city street, these structures must be clearly seen before they can be torn down. Human biology, genuine empathetic connection, and inclusive physical spaces are inextricably intertwined. The front door is no longer just a physical threshold. It stands as the ultimate measure of whether the world we have built is designed for human habitation or merely for human containment.